What's up, Maniacs? My name is Mex. I'm a wrestling fan, a wrestling enthusiast, a WrestleManiac, if you will. And today we are kicking off with the first part of a four-part series looking at the biggest black stars in wrestling over the years. October in the UK is Black History Month. And even though on this channel, we're always covering Black history and Black wrestling, especially through our Tuesday show, Wrestle Extra, during the month of October, we're going to kind of hone in, go deeper into the archives and talk a bit more about our stars of the yesteryears. And I'm happy to be doing it with the guy that we call Knowledge. His name is Earl. Earl, so glad that you finally made your debut right here at WrestleManiac
Yo,
UK. How you doing
I've
today,
been
bro?
looking. I'm good, man. I've been looking forward to chatting with you this week. So yeah, really happy to be here. So and it's a subject that is really important. I think
Yeah.
this talking about black wrestlers in general, really, but especially ones from the past that a lot of people might not know about, or they might have heard the name and they don't know much about the actual person's career. So, some people might find it helpful.
That's exactly it. And obviously, we're pretty much living through a bit of a, I wouldn't say war, but it's not a war. It's like the internet wrestling community having this ongoing debate about black wrestling drawing and who are black top stars in AEW, especially,
Is
what we're
that a debate?
seeing. It's happening.
Do
It's
black
honestly
wrestlers draw?
it's
Okay.
happening, and I'm sure today and over the series you're gonna shed some light on that whole argument and everything. But yeah, I mean, just before we get into it, just tell us a bit about your wrestling journey. When did you start watching? Knew your favorites growing up? Let the people know.
Okay, so I started watching wrestling in 1990, which is a long time ago. I went to school one day, and a kid on the playground had a WWF magazine, and the Ultimate Warrior was on the front, and he was just huge, and he was so colorful. And I went home, and I wanted to watch wrestling. I'd never seen it before, so my dad managed to get a tape. It was a Royal Rumble 1990, and then he got me the tape. And the first ever wrestling match I saw was Ronnie Garvin against Greg Valentine, and it was actually really, even today, it's actually a really good
Good
match. It's
match.
stiff as hell, and I just fell in love with wrestling at that point. I was a big WWF guy until I I always watched other wrestling. Like I always watched WCW because we had it over here on Saturdays, and then when Nitro started, that's when I really was like, oh, this WCW is actually, I prefer this type of wrestling. Then we had New Japan on Eurosport, so I watched that, and then I got involved in ECW around '97. So I was getting tapes from America, and I was learning about Japanese wrestling at that point. So I was a big FMW fan when I was at school, and yeah, I was just really interested in watching as much wrestling as I could. And from I say 2001, I started subscribing to the Observer, and I started really learning about history of wrestling and reading books about pro wrestling. And that's when
Knowledge.
I started to really learn about numbers and gates and attendance and this history of particular people. So yeah, I've been a massive wrestling fan for over 30 years. Like big
Amazing.
wrestling fan. I love the stuff.
Amazing. You're more than qualified to be having this conversation, leading this conversation. Because today, and how we're going to split this four-part series is we are going to be looking at the biggest star, if you like, of each decade of the yesteryear, like I said. So today we're going to start with the 70s, next week the 80s, week after the 90s, and then the 2000s. So without further ado, guys, you know what to do. Smash the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we're going to get into it. The biggest star of the 70s in regards to black wrestling. So the is yours. Let us know who that person is and a bit about them.
Okay, so the black wrestler that I want to focus on as far as talking about the 1970s is someone that I feel has kind of been lost in history a bit. And the reason why I think he's been lost in history a bit is because he's The Rock's dad. Now, I think that Rocky Johnson, um, I think a lot of people just know him as The Rock's dad, and they've seen the old footage of him that's available on WWE Network, and they don't actually realize how big of a star he actually was in pro wrestling, and he was actually really good. And I think over time that's just been lost just because of, unfortunately, Rocky Johnson lives in the shadow of his son, which I'm sure he's happy about in his own way. But um, I think we should. I want to talk about Rocky Johnson today. He was the biggest black draw of that time period. Now, in the early 70s, he wasn't, because I think that Ernie Ladd was still a big draw from the early 70s, because he was a massive draw in the 60s. But Rocky Johnson really took over that mantle, and he was a huge star. He was a really in-demand wrestler throughout the whole 1970 period. He only went to the WWF later on when his body was breaking down, and that's what wrestlers did back then. They did as much as they could, and then they went for their final run in the WWF because the work wasn't as
stiff.
The wrestling wasn't as important per se. You could get away with doing the bare minimum over in the WWF.
Value.
Yeah, you could get away with standing in the corner and stamping your foot on the corner and holding your hand out for a tag. That kind of stuff, that hokey stuff that the wrestlers used to make fun of it. They'd say, "Oh, it's working New York style," because it was just so hokey, and so that's what they did back then. But Rocky Johnson, yeah. So I can start from the top and just give you a rundown of exactly about this guy.
Let us know, some of the key places he worked, his feuds, titles he had. Obviously, we know what he went on to do in terms of give birth to probably the biggest sports entertainer in the world. Yeah. Just let us know a few bits about him.
There's a few interesting things I want to say, because he was his grandmother was a slave, and they actually escaped, and they went all the way from Mississippi to Nova Scotia in Canada, and he grew up there. And his dad died when he was 13 years old, and his mum actually had a relationship with this guy really soon after his dad had died. And there's a story that Dwayne told this story, and in Rocky's book he tells a story too, about this guy at Christmas dinner. He was so angry, he was just drunk, and then he got up and he peed on the turkey at Christmas dinner, this man. So anyway, Rocky hit him with a shovel and knocked him out, and his mum basically said, "You need to get out of here." So she picked this man over her son. It's true. And he wasn't born Rocky Johnson, obviously. His real name was Wayne Boyles.
So Wayne and Dwayne.
Yeah. I never thought that, yeah. Wayne Boyles. He changed his name years later to Rocky Johnson. So yeah, Dwayne Johnson is actually his real name. Otherwise, it would have been Dwayne Boyles.
Yeah.
But yeah. So he went to Toronto. He ran away, 13 years old. He left home and he went to Toronto, where he learned how to box. And in becoming a boxer, he actually learned to be a pro wrestler at the same time. And he was pretty much a star really early on. He was actually really good. He had a huge physique. He was really into bodybuilding, and he had a really good physique. And he really hit it big in 1970. He went to San Francisco, and he worked for Roy Shire. Now, when he worked for Roy Shire, he had his first night in, he won a battle royal, and he beat the great Kajika in the same night to win the company title, which was the San Francisco Championship. He actually won it on his first night. And he had.
Sorry, before you go on, Roy Shire, is that like the name of the promotion, or what was the promotion?
So Roy Shire ran San Francisco. Back in the day when pro wrestling was broken up into territories, Roy Shire had the San Francisco territory. There was no national promotion at that point because television didn't work that way. So what would happen was wrestlers would stay in local areas for that particular area's television. And when their run was finished, they would go to another territory. So a lot of wrestlers would just move around the country. They'd move their families around too. I'm sure you've heard the stories about The Rock being at so many different schools because his dad was moving around the country. So Roy Shire really liked Rocky. He was charismatic, he was big, and he could really, really wrestle too. And he had it's a huge feud he had with Freddie Blassie in 1970. Like, it was really big. It was one of the biggest feuds in the history of that promotion. And he was Rocky Johnson from the moment he walked into San Francisco, just because of the way he looked, and he was so good, he was over. He had he teamed with Pat Patterson for many, many years. They were really good friends. Pat Patterson's the guy that gave The Rock a job. Rocky called in the favor. But so he worked for 4 years full-time in San Francisco, and he actually teamed with another black wrestler called Earl Maynard, who was actually Mr. Universe. If you ever see Earl Maynard, pictures of Earl Maynard from back in the day, he looked amazing. Like, he had to be Mr. Universe. He wasn't a good wrestler though, Earl Maynard. I've only seen one of his matches back. There's not many of this stuff on tape. there's not much on tape. The reason why is because the TV stations, they didn't see the value in keeping old wrestling shows. They didn't understand what it could be worth years later, so they tape over them, and they just constantly tape over the tapes, because tapes back then were expensive. They were like $100. Yeah, so they just continuously tape over them. But Earl Maynard was his partner. They had the San Francisco tag belts. Once he had it with Rocky Johnson. A feud that Rocky had, which comes to mind, it was actually a really big feud at the time, was in 1975. He had a feud with Joe Lawler in Memphis, and this is actually one of the biggest drawing feuds in the history of that territory. So what happened was Jerry Jarrett had this idea. Do you know about the Ali and Inoki fight?
I've heard of this before, but I know there's some drama around it.
That's a story for another time. But Antonio Inoki had a fight with Muhammad Ali. It was a real fight.
Yeah.
And around that period, promoters wanted boxer versus wrestler matches. So Jerry Jarrett had this idea to do to put Jerry Lawler against a boxer. However, he didn't want a real boxer. He wanted one that could actually wrestle. So they heard that Rocky Johnson was a wrestler, and they knew that he could draw from being in San Francisco. And they knew that people in Memphis wouldn't know who he was, because Memphis and San Francisco are so far away. The TV would never intermingle anyway. So they made up a record, and they said he was a knockout artist, and that he was the number 6 ranked heavyweight in the world, and he was, gearing up for a fight with Muhammad Ali. Back then there was no Google, so you could just say this outlandish stuff.
No one can check it.
No one could check. He actually did spar with Ali, though.
Okay.
Many years before, he did spar with Ali and George Foreman. He actually said that he taught Ali how to do the Ali shuffle, which I'm very skeptical of. But so they did this feud, and you know what? It's actually on YouTube, because I saw it about a year ago. They got Rocky Johnson on the news, and on the news he's talking about how he's going to beat Muhammad Ali for the title. But before that, he's going to beat Jerry Lawler at the Mid-South Coliseum, come down, and great stuff. Anyway, they do the match. Sells out the Mid-South Coliseum. The first time they sold out the Mid-South Coliseum in 10 months. All right, 11,000 seats. And Rocky lost because the excuse was he didn't know the rules. But he got over, and the fans loved him. So they did a rematch, and he beat Jerry the second time. And that's when he told the fans that he was going to quit boxing and become a full-time wrestler and live in Memphis or whatever, which he did. He actually he actually worked in Memphis for a couple of years full-time. He got a guarantee from Jerry Jarrett, because back then guys didn't get guarantees, they'd work by the gate. But he actually got a guarantee. His wife said $500. In his book, he says $2,500. I believe his wife. So let's say he got $500 guaranteed. Yeah. He also worked a lot of other places, but Memphis was going to be his home territory. So he actually did a few sellouts in Memphis throughout the whole period he was there. He had a few big feuds. He did one with the Jerry Lawler one went on for a while, and he also did Bill Dundee. They had a big feud with Bill Dundee as well. Which did really big business. He was actually the first wrestler to win the Southern title as well when he beat Jerry Lawler. The first black wrestler that won the Southern title. He's also the first black wrestler to win the Florida championship in 1978 when he beat Curtis Ikea. So, that's 2 big firsts for him. So those are some highlights of the period. Now, what I'll do is I'll go on to the other side of his life, which was his relationship with the Samoans.
Yeah.
So he met Peter Maivia in 1971, because him and Peter Maivia used to team in San Francisco, and Peter Maivia really liked him, and he met Peter's daughter Wuzata, and they got married, and Dwayne was born the next year. Okay. Actually, speaking of real names, Peter Maivia was not Peter Maivia's real name. His real name was Peter Anderson.
Oh,
and
yeah. Wait. This guy they call High Chief Peter Maivia.
Yeah, High Chief Peter Anderson.
He's actually Peter Anderson.
Peter Anderson was his name, and he was Samoan, and he did. Okay, I think he was a legit Samoan High Chief. He was, but the issue is that his name didn't sound Samoan at all. So there was a Samoan wrestler. The only Samoan wrestler that the promoter promoter in the UK, it might have been Max Crabtree. I don't remember what UK promoter it was, but he said your name isn't Samoan enough, and the only Samoan wrestler he knew was Neff Maava. So he said you can be Peter Maava, and he spelled it wrong, and it was Maivia. So then his name became High Chief Peter Maivia. Yeah, but yeah, bit of trivia there. And yeah, so he worked for the Hawaii Territory over for the person who owned the Hawaii Territory when he worked there would have been Ed Francis. Ed Francis ran it for about 17 years. The problem with Hawaii, the Hawaii Territory though, was the population was so small. There was a lot of wrestling fans, but the population was so small and there wasn't many buildings to run. There was probably about 3 buildings that you actually run. And it was hard to draw from the same people over and over again because the island was so small. Now, the wrestlers liked working there because you get to fly out to Hawaii and you get to live this life of, this easy life where the weather's great and everyone knows who you are because the island's so small, but drawing was really hard. So Ed Francis sold the territory to, who did he sell it to? He sold it to, last name was Rickard. What's his first name? It might have been Paul Rickard, who only had it for 2 years because Paul Rickard had this thing where he would only promote big shows and he'd fly big names in to do one nights. But when you do that, profit margins are so small. So he actually sold a territory to Peter Maivia, and he only had it for 2 years. He passed away, and then Leah took over. And when Leah took over, that's when Rocky actually invested all of his money into the Hawaii wrestling territory, and it didn't work out for him, and he went broke. And that's when they were evicted. You ever seen the episode of Young Rock where they get evicted from their house?
Yes.
It was from that time because Rocky Johnson was actually really good with his money, and until he invested money into that promotion, and they went broke, and it wasn't good for them for a while. He was literally drifting from place to place trying to find work, in all honesty.
Which was detailed in Young Rock as well.
It was in Young Rock. There's a lot that they can explore in Young Rock. But yeah, they went broke over that period. His WWF run, sorry, but before I forget, he had a run in the WWF in, I think it was 81, he went there. And he wasn't the same wrestler as he was. If you watch the footage of him, he seems very slow. Yeah, work-wise, he's still better than most of the guys there. Because the New York, like I said, it's very plodding, so he was actually better than most of the guys there. But if you compare him to what he looked like before, he had a very athletic style and he just couldn't do that stuff anymore. He had a really high drop kick, like Okada, very high drop kick. The only difference is that Okada does one, Rocky would do a series of 3. And it's literally right to the top of the head. It was really impressive. And he won the tag belts with Tony Atlas. They beat the Samoans in 83. And they had a really short run. They only had like a 4-month run because they hated each other. Like Tony Atlas and Rocky Johnson absolutely despised each other. And they asked Vince Jr. to get the belts off us, So they lost the belts to Adrian Adonis and Dick Murdoch. They lost the belts to them. It was a 4-month reign. And then Rocky, he stuck around for a bit longer, but they got rid of him after a while because there was no point having him at that point. And yeah.
Would you say his I guess his biggest star, his biggest period then was on just doing the work through the territories then, rather than actually getting to WWF?
Well, WWF back then wasn't the place to be sort of thing. The place to be was St. Louis, and he was a big star at St. Louis too. He had multiple 60-minute Broadways with Harley Race for the NWA title. He was a black wrestler that would regularly compete for the NWA title. He had 60-minute Broadways with Terry Funk and Dory Funk, and he had quite a few of Ric Flair as well over that period. He was always guaranteed to do big business, Rocky Johnson, over the 1970s period. And in Florida too, he did good business with Dusty Rhodes when Dusty Rhodes was a heel. And Dick Murdoch in Florida too. So, back then, the whole thing that promoters wanted to know is, could you draw?
Yeah.
Could we depend on you to make us money? And Rocky Johnson would always do that throughout the whole of the 1970s. He was the biggest black wrestler of that period. He was a bloody good worker as well. And I think that over time he's kind of just been forgotten about. But um, if there was more footage on him, I think history would treat him a bit more kindly, you know. But his son is a huge star. He trained his son. He trained his son, and they had a rocky relationship. Always had a rocky relationship, just because I think Rocky was a bit he was a bit of a womanizer, and I think Dwayne always kind of held that against him. I don't think that's portrayed in the Young Rock show, but that's the true issue there. And then years later, even towards the end, when Rock was a big star, I think they did have a strained relationship even up to the end, really. But he passed away last January, Rocky Johnson. But like I said, he was a really, really big star, and he was. I wish some of those matches was on tape, because a lot of these matches I've never seen. I just know the gates, and I just know the attendances. I know that he sold out, at Kiel Auditorium against Ric Flair. They did 17,000 seats there, and they did the same 17,000 again with Harley Race multiple times, 60-minute draws, So he's definitely one that we need to give flowers to, basically.
100%. And if there's, just before we close up here, is there anyone like today you would say his style was kind of akin to, like, anyone of the modern day, no matter what promotion?
Oh man, it's different. There's a lot of wrestlers that are better than him, just because wrestling's evolved so much. I'd probably say it's not today, but probably Davey Boy Smith.
Okay.
The 1995 to 96 Davey Boy Smith, who was quite muscular and still very agile as well. Davey was very agile. I'd probably compare him to him if I could think of one person. I can't think of anyone now. I probably could if I really thought about it. But as far as star quality and charisma and drawing ability, I don't think there's anyone in wrestling that I could compare to Rocky Johnson. It's just a different business.
Yeah.
These guys had to go out there and they had to, cut interviews so that, so people could show up at the buildings, so that way they could get paid. Nowadays, TV networks pay,
They
so
handle
it's
all of that sort of thing.
Yeah.
There's advertising, there's marketing. Yeah.
Exactly. There's that need isn't there anymore from the wrestlers like it was back then, but yeah.
Cool. So a little insight into Rocky Johnson. I mean, the fact he was called Wayne and his son is Dwayne is actually still killing me. But it is what it is. Oh, thank you very much for kind of giving us that insight. And that was the biggest star of the 70s. So we will be back next week to talk about the biggest star of the 80s. Guys, before we sign out, I'm going to be trying to do my part of putting out some or advertising, should I say, some merch of other black wrestlers or guys in the media and stuff like that. And I'll start today with showing you Roy Johnson's latest merch. This one isn't even out yet, so we're dealing with exclusives, people. That's what we do over here. But yeah, hit up Roy Johnson. I'm gonna put a link to his social media down below in the description box, so you can get in contact with him, all his links, and get yourself some merch supporting a black wrestler from the UK as well. Oh, any last words on Rocky Johnson or anything before we get out of here?
I think I've said enough about Rocky Johnson. Go and check him out. There's his matches on YouTube that you guys can go and check out. And you know what? They might not hold up today as well as they did then, but they're still really good. And if, especially for any wrestlers out there who want to learn something new, there's always value in watching Rocky Johnson, even in 2021. So yeah, give him a go. You won't be disappointed.
Cool. Thank you very much, Earl. Guys, you've heard it from Knowledge himself. Go and check out Rocky Johnson, and let us know down below in the comments your favorite kind of fact that let us know about Rocky Johnson. Like I said, I know what mine is, but let us know down below what you really enjoyed from this video. And like I said, next week we're going to be talking about the 80s and biggest star from the 80s. If If you like this video, give it a big thumbs up, hit the thumbs up button. And if you're new to the channel, welcome to the channel, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you get notified each and every time I drop a new video. WrestleManiac UK signing out, and I'll see you